Unlike the typical emotional manipulator who consciously seeks to control or guilt others for personal gain, the moral controller truly believes they're doing good. This is not a game for them, nor a scheme. They are sincerely convinced they are helping, healing, enlightening. And it is precisely this conviction, this unwavering belief in their own righteousness, that makes their influence so deeply toxic. Because when control hides behind the mask of virtue, when judgment is dressed in the robes of love, and when authority claims spiritual legitimacy, it becomes nearly impossible to challenge. Their criticism doesn't come in the form of obvious attacks. It arrives cloaked in care. It sounds like, "I'm only telling you this for your own good," or "one day you'll thank me," or "someone has to be brave enough to speak the truth." But this so-called truth isn't neutral. It is soaked in projection. It tests not insight. It is a reflection of everything the moral controller has repressed in themselves. In Ion, Carl Jung delves deep into the archetypes of Christ and the Antichrist, symbols not of good and evil in the traditional sense, but of psychological wholeness and disintegration. The Christ figure represents integration, the union of opposites. The Antichrist is the shadow of this integration, the unacknowledged, the denied, the disowned. The moral controller believes they're embodying the light. They imagine themselves righteous, awake, spiritually superior. But in this very process, they lose sight of their own shadow. They split. Everything impure, wrong, or evil is seen not as part of their own psyche, but as something to be fought outside, in you and others. And this is what makes them so dangerous. Because they don't see their aggression as aggression. They see it as teaching, their judgment as truth, their suppression as guidance. And if you live close to someone like this, a parent, a partner, a mentor, a spiritual figure, you may slowly start to internalize their lens. You begin to feel guilty simply for existing, for being who you are. You start to second-guess your choices, your feelings, your instincts. Even your joy feels suspicious. Even your desires seem shameful. And worst of all, you begin to believe them. You mistake their projection for truth. Over time, your authentic self, the spontaneous, alive, messy, growing self, begins to shrink. You start molding yourself to fit their moral framework. But their morality was never yours. And in trying to fit into it, you end up imprisoned. This dynamic often thrives in tightly controlled systems. Traditional families, religious institutions, authoritarian cultures, places where obedience is mistaken for virtue. And it's in these systems where the moral controller finds fertile ground. Jung warned that wherever excessive moralism takes root, true self-knowledge is absent. Because moralism is not the pursuit of truth. It is the pursuit of control. It isn't about seeing. It's about regulating, policing, silencing. And when the moral controller can no longer control the external world, politics, society, culture, they shift focus inward, toward the psyche of those closest to them. They invade not with force, but with moral superiority. They colonize your inner voice. Your inner compass becomes confused. And slowly, your own sense of what's good, what's true, what's real fades. The most devastating part? You don't realize it's happening until you're deep in it. Because unlike physical abuse or overt manipulation, this kind of control operates on the level of identity. You begin to believe you are wrong, flawed, unworthy, not because of what you've done, but because of who you are. You might find yourself apologizing for things that don't need apologies. You become hyper-vigilant, always monitoring your behavior, your tone, your choices, anything that might trigger judgment. You walk on eggshells in the name of peace. But there is no peace. There is only performance. And the deeper tragedy is this: the moral controller, for all their righteousness, is often blind to their own inner wounds. In fact, it is often those wounds, unresolved, repressed, denied, that drive their need to control in the first place. What they cannot accept in themselves, they try to destroy in others. Jung's warning was clear. The path of individuation, the journey toward a whole and conscious self, cannot coexist with unconscious moralism. Because where there is rigid moral judgment, there is no space for depth, contradiction, or shadow. The moralist sees life as binary, right or wrong, good or bad, pure or corrupt, and in doing so, they cut off the complexity of the soul. But the soul is never binary. The soul is paradox. The moral controller refuses paradox. And so, they remain fragmented. And anyone who gets too close to them feels that fragmentation as pressure, as guilt, as inner conflict. But the story doesn't end here. The moral controller is just one face of unconscious domination. There is another, far more volatile, unpredictable, and emotionally explosive figure that often lurks in the shadows of relationships. This figure doesn't moralize. They erupt. They collapse. They manipulate not with virtue, but with pain. They are the complexed, the ones possessed by unresolved emotional fragments that hijack their behavior and destabilize everything around them. And in the next chapter, we'll enter their world. While the moral controller represses, projects, and polices the emotional life of others in the name of virtue, the complexed individual operates in an entirely different realm of the unconscious, one ruled not by control, but by chaos. The complexed person isn't interested in moral superiority. They aren't consciously trying to correct you, shape you, or save you. But they are just as dangerous, if not more, because their behavior is dictated by inner forces they do not understand and cannot control. They are driven, not by intention, but by emotional possession. By what Jung called complexes, autonomous psychic entities formed from trauma, wounds, and unresolved past experiences that have become split off from the conscious ego. To live with a complexed person is to live on shifting ground. One moment, they're affectionate, warm, generous, even loving. The next, they explode, or they withdraw, or they accuse you of some betrayal you never committed. You find yourself constantly guessing what might trigger the next rupture, the next wave of sorrow, the next act of emotional sabotage. But no matter how careful you are, how much you adapt, how much you tiptoe, it's never enough. Something always breaks. And the reason it breaks is not because of you. The complexed person is not reacting to you. They're reacting to ghosts, to memories, to emotional imprints from the past that live on inside them, disguised as present threats. A small comment touches an old wound. A harmless joke echoes a forgotten humiliation. A delay in a message reactivates a primal fear of abandonment. And before you know it, you're no longer in a conversation, you're in a battlefield. Not of the present, but of history. Their history. Carl Jung, especially in psychological types, and the ego, and the unconscious, describes complexes as psychic fragments that split off from the conscious ego and operate independently, almost like subpersonalities. When a complex is triggered, it seizes control. The person is no longer acting with awareness. They are being acted upon. And to them, the reaction feels justified, logical, real, but it's not. It's a replay. This is why dealing with a complex person can be so disorienting. They often don't remember what they said during their emotional outbursts. Or if they do, they downplay it, deny it, or shift blame. There are moments of lucidity, of tenderness, of remorse, and those moments keep you there. They convince you that things aren't always like this, that this person is trying, that there's still hope, and maybe there is. But here's the danger. Those moments of clarity are the exception, not the rule. The emotional storm always returns. And every time it does, it costs you more of your stability, your peace, your sense of self. You start adapting in subtle, heartbreaking ways. You avoid certain topics. You minimize your needs. You stop asking questions. You hold back your truth. And not because you're afraid of punishment, but because you're trying to avoid pain, theirs and your own. But the pain doesn't go away, because no matter how gentle, loving, or accommodating you are, the complex remains. It waits, it watches, it feeds on vulnerability, and eventually it re-emerges, more powerful, more demanding, more desperate to be felt and to be projected. The complexed person lives in a constant loop between fragmentation and reunion. Their psyche swings between connection and collapse. They love, but their love is infused with fear. They trust, but their trust is fragile. And when it breaks, they don't just hurt, they collapse. And in that collapse, they pull others down with them. What makes this dynamic even more destructive is its unpredictability. You can't prepare for it. You never know which version of the person you'll meet today, the affectionate one or the accuser, the one who embraces or the one who vanishes. You begin to live in survival mode, hyper-attuned to emotional shifts, facial expressions, tone changes. You learn to read the smallest cues, to avoid the emotional landmines, and in the process, you lose yourself. Because this is what happens when you share space with someone governed by unconscious complexes. Their wounds start becoming your reality. Their ghosts begin haunting you. And slowly, you forget what it felt like to live without tension, without fear, without the need to constantly shrink. You begin to doubt yourself, your memory, your perception, your emotional responses. You start thinking, maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I did provoke it. Maybe I should have known better. This is the tragic magic of emotional possession. It doesn't just affect the one who has complexed. It spreads, it infects, it colonizes. And perhaps the most painful part? They don't even know they're doing it. The complexed person is not acting out of malice. They are acting out of unconscious pain. But unprocessed pain is not innocent. It causes damage, especially when it's disguised as love. Jung warned that the unrecognized complex doesn't just disturb the psyche, it takes over. It begins to think for you, feel for you, react for you. And if left unchecked, it can drive a person into psychological fragmentation. Their identity becomes porous. Their relationships become unstable. And their emotional world becomes a storm without a center. If you're close to someone like this, you know what it means to feel drained, not because of effort, but because of confusion. You spend so much energy trying to decode, soothe, repair, explain, and still, nothing ever feels resolved. And this unresolved tension becomes addictive. You stay because you hope that the real person will return, but they never fully do. Because they are not fully here. Not yet. Not until they see what lives inside them. And here's the brutal truth. You cannot do this work for them, no matter how much you love them, no matter how clearly you see the pattern, no matter how many times you forgive. The work of integrating a complex is personal. It requires courage, self-honesty, and deep psychological commitment. And until they are willing to face their own shadow, they will continue to live possessed, and you will continue to live on the edge of someone else's trauma. But the complexed person is still not the end of this journey. There is one more figure, quieter, more subtle, yet profoundly depleting. This one does not explode, moralize, or accuse. They drain. And in the next chapter, we will meet them, the psychic vampire. There are people who don't want your presence. They want your energy. Not your ideas, your boundaries, your individuality, or your truth. Just the life force that moves through you. And they will take it slowly, quietly, until you're no longer sure where you end and they begin. This is the psychic vampire. They don't yell. They don't control through virtue or explode with trauma. Their power lies in subtlety. in emotional dependency dressed up as closeness, an endless need cloaked as love, in a hunger that has no end, because what they read truly starving for is something they must learn to find within. But instead, they try to take it from you, and they are good at it. They do not appear dangerous. In fact, they often come across as the most sensitive, gentle, and emotionally vulnerable people in your life. Their vulnerability is real, but it's not harmless, because it's unprocessed, uncontained, and projected outward. They don't ask you to walk with them. They ask you to carry them. At first, it feels like love, a bond, a deep connection. They seem to need you. They listen. They share. They show pain, and you, being compassionate, open, and strong, respond. You offer comfort. You make space. You're there, and they absorb it. All of it, but they don't grow from it. That's the difference. Because true connection, the kind that heals, requires reciprocity. The psychic vampire doesn't reciprocate, not out of malice, but because they can't. They are emotionally undeveloped in crucial ways. Their inner child is still calling the shots. And rather than learning to soothe that inner pain, they look to others to do it for them, again and again. You begin by offering support. Then you give more. Then, without realizing it, you're reorganizing your life around their emotions. You censor your truth to avoid triggering their wounds. You apologize for needing space. You tolerate emotional guilt-tripping in the name of empathy. And slowly, invisibly, you start to disappear. Jung never used the term psychic vampire, but he saw this dynamic with piercing clarity. In his writings on symbiosis, especially in the ego and the unconscious and ion, he described relationships where two people fuse psychologically. These are not partnerships. They are psychic mergers, where one person lives through the energy of the other. And the result is always the same: psychic stagnation. For Jung, this symbiotic entanglement was one of the greatest threats to individuation, the path of becoming whole. Because individuation requires differentiation. It requires boundaries. It requires a strong sense of I. The psychic vampire doesn't want that. They want fusion. They want you, not as a person, but as a source. You begin to feel tired, but not the normal kind of tired, an existential exhaustion, like you're being slowly emptied, drained, as if something in your core is being quietly siphoned. Day by day, you look in the mirror and feel less alive, less radiant, less you, and still you stay. Because their need feels so sincere, their wounds feel so familiar. You tell yourself they just need time, support, healing. But what they really need is not something you can give, because the void inside them is not your responsibility. The psychic vampire operates from a deep unconscious fear of abandonment. And this fear is so powerful, so unbearable, that they unconsciously manipulate the emotional environment to keep you close. They may use guilt. You're all I have. They may flip roles. You're the one who's being distant. They may make you feel selfish for wanting space, or cold for setting boundaries. You start to believe it. You begin to feel guilty for needing your own life, your own time, your own emotional freedom. The line between compassion and obligation starts to blur. And once you cross that line, the spiral begins. Because the psychic vampire doesn't only feed on your energy, they redefine your identity. They shape your role into something that serves their needs. And the longer you stay, the more you adapt. You stop initiating conversations with others because they might get jealous. You tone down your joy because it makes them feel left out. You cancel plans because they had a hard day. Little by little, your world narrows, until the only reality left is the one you share with them. And even that doesn't feel like yours anymore. Jung wrote that when an individual cannot sustain their own psychic life, they attach to others parasitically. Not out of evil, but out of unconscious immaturity. And he was clear. This is not love. It is possession. A dynamic of dependency masquerading as intimacy. And it always leads to destruction, either of the relationship or of the self. You may even find yourself becoming the vampire. Yes, that's the most uncomfortable truth. Because when you live in this pattern long enough, when you suppress your truth, abandon your needs, and absorb the other's emotional reality, your own soul starts starving. And when your soul starves, it begins to take. We are all susceptible to this, because we all have shadow. We all have pain. And if that pain remains unconscious, we either become the one who drains or the one who is drained. This is why awareness is not optional. It is survival. Jung's path was always the same. Make the unconscious conscious, not just in others, but in ourselves. The psychic vampire needs healing, but not through you, through self-awareness, through responsibility, through the painful but necessary process of psychological growth. And you too need healing, not through martyrdom, but through boundaries. If you recognize yourself in this pattern, whether as the one being drained or the one who drains, do not judge, but do not stay asleep, because waking up is the first, most radical act of freedom. You begin to reclaim your life, your vitality, your sense of direction. You begin to individuate. And that is the path Jung dedicated his life to. Not perfection, but wholeness. Not avoidance of darkness, but integration. Not control of others, but sovereignty of the self. We've now seen the three figures that distort human connection: the moral controller, the complexed, and the psychic vampire. Each one an archetype of unintegrated unconscious forces. Each one a mirror. Each one a call to awaken. But there's still one more step in this journey, because knowledge without practice is just information. The real question is, how do we free ourselves? How do we move from being possessed by these forces to living in conscious alignment? In the next and final chapter, we'll explore what Jung believed to be the true way out. The path of individuation, shadow integration, and psychological sovereignty. After traveling through the landscapes of moral control, emotional possession, and psychic vampirism, we arrive at the most important question Jung ever posed, not about others, but about the self. Who are you beneath the projections? Beneath the masks, beneath the fear, beneath the compulsions and roles that you didn't choose, but inherited, adapted, or were coerced into. For Jung, the answer lies in individuation, a path not of perfection, but of wholeness. A journey where you integrate rather than eliminate, confront rather than conform. It is the opposite of control, the opposite of unconscious repetition, the opposite of being someone else's mirror. Individuation is not a one-time realization. It's a lifelong unfolding. It starts when you stop asking, how do I fix them? And begin asking, why am I entangled? When you stop carrying the psychic weight of those who refuse to carry their own. It is the path of becoming an individual in the deepest, most sacred sense of the word. This does not mean walking away from everyone who is wounded. It means not becoming their wound. It means recognizing the patterns, naming the ghosts, and refusing to let your soul be colonized by another's shadow. Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. In the presence of the moral controller, you begin to shrink to fit someone else's morality. In the presence of the complexed, you lose your footing in a reality that is not your own. In the presence of the psychic vampire, you give away your vitality, drop by drop in the name of empathy. But in the presence of your own soul, your full, fragmented, glorious, shadow-bearing soul, something else happens. You begin to return, to reclaim, to remember. You realize you were never broken, only buried. This is not a path for those who want comfort. It is for those who want truth. Not surface-level wellness, but radical self-reclamation. Not spiritual bypassing, but descent into the underworld of your psyche and return with your gold. And here's the paradox. The more you look at your own shadow, the less you need to fight it in others. The more you meet your pain consciously, the less it controls your relationships. The more you individuate, the less you manipulate or are manipulated. This is freedom not from others, but from your own unconscious patterns. Not freedom to isolate, but freedom to connect from a place of wholeness. Not freedom to dominate, but to relate. Jung never promised that this path would be easy, but he knew it was necessary. And so now the question turns to you, not just as a listener or viewer, but as a participant in your own inner unfolding. Who in this story have you recognized in others? Who in this story have you secretly seen in yourself? These aren't easy reflections, but they are the doorway to transformation. Let this not be just another video. Let it be a turning point. Because if you've made it this far, it means something in you is ready to see, to wake up, to reclaim your sovereignty from every false self you've worn. And this is what Jung meant by healing, not to become someone else, but to fully, finally become yourself.